Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Caroline Helleman. She's the digital director of Town and Country magazine. Her work has often focused on the British monarchy and the closest thing America has to a royal family, the Kennedys. Her book, The Kennedys and The Windsors, is the true story of two dynasties, one born, one made. Much has been written about their individual trysts, tragedies and triumphs over the years, but no one has examined their intertwined legacies until now. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. So what made you look into these two families and their intertwining legacies?
Well, as you said, I work at Town and Country magazine in the U.S. And so I've been covering both of these families for 10 years. But it was really when Prince William came to Boston in 2022 that I started to think about kind of their relationship and their shared history. He had launched the Earthshot Prize and was bringing it to the United States for the second awards. And Prince William has often said that the prize was, at least in part, inspired by President Kennedy's moonshot, when he said, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back home within the decade. And we don't know how we're going to do that yet, but we're going to make it happen. And when William came to Boston, he really leaned into this kind of Kennedy inspiration, meeting with Caroline Kennedy, who is President Kennedy's daughter, and touring the JFK Library and a number of other engagements. And I just found that to be really interesting because of, in part, the Kennedy nickname that they're often referred to as the closest thing America has to a royal family. And here was a member of the British royal family, a prominent one, kind of using that iconography and that language of the Kennedy administration and the Kennedy legacy to kind of launch his own project in America. And I just thought that was interesting. And so that from there, I started looking into their shared history, and I thought, this might be an interesting book. And there wasn't one out there yet. So I sat down to start researching, and here we are several years later.
Oh, brilliant. And there's so many similarities going through various different members of each family. One of the things you point out, the frustrated second sisters, if you like, looking at Princess Margaret and Lee, is it Radziwill? I'm not sure how you say it, sorry.
Radziwill, exactly.
Radziwill.
Exactly. Yes, that's Jackie's younger sister.
Okay.
And absolutely, I mean, there are so many parallels, but I love, that idea of the second sisters who, have to be kind of one step out of the spotlight, but at the same time have a bit more freedom, and are, often, had led very interesting lives.
Yes. And also looking at other family members, for example, Queen Elizabeth II and Jackie Kennedy, bringing up their children and similarities with that.
Absolutely. I think many people know about President Kennedy and Jackie's 1961 visit to Buckingham Palace, which was actually the first time Queen Elizabeth II had hosted a U.S. president at Buckingham Palace, and she was very excited. And I know, many people know of that meeting from its kind of dramatization in The Crown. But that meeting, it didn't quite go as planned. Jackie, she didn't quite like Queen Elizabeth's dress and things like that. But the two women actually had quite a lot in common, and they had a good relationship. They were both young mothers, kind of living in the public eye. They had proximity to power, but not true political power, and enormous influence, but not that real kind of political power, which is interesting to think about how they used that influence. And they both loved horses. That was kind of their one true hobby and their one true passion. And that's actually what they spoke quite a lot about.
It's interesting looking at the women, particularly through the history of both families. You focus on that a lot in the book, whether they're the prominent members of the family or the wives of the prominent members of the family. It's often the women that are talked about, certainly the most in the press and photographed the most as well.
Absolutely. That was one of the first things that when I was thinking about, I wanted this book to not only be kind of a chronology of when the two families met throughout history, their various kind of intersections and meetings, but also a bit of a comparison between them. And I thought quite a lot about how difficult it is for women to join these two families. I think many people draw parallels between Princess Diana and what she went through and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and what she went through. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy is the wife of JFK Jr., the late wife of JFK Jr. And both of them, I think they struggled with the expectations that were put upon them, both by internally from the family and from the media in terms of scrutiny. And as you say, often women are covered kind of more prominently in the press and often negatively. I think we see that too with the current Princess of Wales, Catherine, as well as Meghan Markle. And I think, I think that's a rich parallel between these two families.
Yeah, I do find the press is the way they deal with various members of the royal family very fascinating, particularly the women. I mean, you mentioned Catherine. As far as I can remember, according to the British press, she can do no wrong. They absolutely love her. She always looks, I agree, she does always look stunning, but they'll always print that she looks stunning, she looks elegant, she carries herself well. I mean, it's all I think, always been positive, which is really lovely to read. But the sad reality is it's always been the opposite for Meghan. And I really feel that the poor woman can't do right, according to the British press. It doesn't matter what she does. They'll lay into her and rip her apart. And I find it vile.
When I was researching for this book, I went back and I rewatched the Oprah interview, kind of that infamous kind of bombshell sit down with Oprah Winfrey, in which they kind of, Harry and Meghan, told their side of the story. They laid bare what happened. And I was really struck by just how difficult of a time she had. I think in the time since that interview, when they first left, so many things, everything that they've tried, her TV show and Spare, Prince Harry's book, and all of that has kind of muddied what happened to them and what happened to her in particular. And watching that interview, I was like, oh my goodness, she had such a difficult time in joining the royal family. And hearing her speak about that again, I was really struck by that. And again, I think it's interesting to think about the parallel between Carolyn Bessette there as well, too, because people had such expectations for what the wife of John F. Kennedy Jr. would be like. And I think people had such expectations for what the wife of Prince Harry would be like. And when Meghan wasn't that, they had such an intense reaction to that. And I think that is what Meghan went through.
Yeah. And still is going through. I mean, it's constant. It feels like it's almost every day that there's something. It probably isn't, but certainly every week that there'll be something in one of the tabloids, saying something not very nice about Meghan Markle. And, some people have sort of tarnished Harry with the same brush. There's a lot of people that believe his book was incredibly inappropriate and, not fair on his father, and the fact that they're not talking is all Harry's fault. And other people feel sorry for Harry and think that Meghan's controlling him like some kind of weird puppet, and the guy has no thought for himself, and it's all her, which is equally bizarre, I think.
I know I don't have the latest. I know there's some question about this trip that's coming up for them to the UK, but I will be curious. I will be curious when they do go to the UK, when Meghan steps out in the UK, what the reaction is there, certainly. And just as a point on Spare, I think as a biographer, as a researcher, I know many people that you think that was inappropriate. As you say, that was one reaction to the book. But as a biographer, I thought it was so interesting to read his perspective, his first person story. I think to have that on the record in such a way, certainly, as a historian, I think is helpful and interesting.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I agree. I thought it was an enlightening read. But again, the way that the royal family has been seen and expected over the years is not to talk about themselves, not to talk about family relationships. We're supposed to look at them on this pedestal, and they're there for duty and not much else, it seems. We're not supposed to think of them as to being emotional or having difficulties. And I think Harry, sort of, to me anyway, I seem to have a different opinion to most other people I chat to on this subject, but I think he showed himself to be human and a man with feelings, and that was really nice to see, I think.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it reminds people of Princess Diana, certainly. I think she had that as well. And I think, in writing this book, I often get asked kind of what you want people to take away from it. And one of the biggest things is that that all of these people and these families are just people. They have enormous privilege and enormous responsibility. And of course, if there are misdeeds or, serious issues, they should be held accountable for them. And they should feel a responsibility to be responsible with the power that they do have. But I think, living life in public like that is unimaginable to me. And thinking about, in particular, the idea of having your very worst moments play out on the public stage, whether that's something embarrassing or, where you have a bad day in public and people pick apart your appearance, or something far more tragic, the loss of a parent, and you have to kind of grieve in public with a public that is also upset, but in a way that's so different from how you would be dealing with it. I just can't imagine what that is like to live with that scrutiny every day.
Yeah. And even though you make the point that one of these families was, everybody was born into the family and one was more made, at the same time, each child that was born into both families didn't choose to be there and have had to deal with the fame and the wealth that has come with it. And it's very easy on the outside to look at people of privilege and think, well, lucky them. How lucky are you to be born into the royal family? But as we've seen over the last few years, with the two brothers not speaking to each other and Harry potentially not speaking to his father, the king, and vice versa, just because you have money and privilege, it doesn't mean you have love and happiness.
No, not at all. And I think, and again, I think they have my sympathy to have to go through things like that, not only internally. We all have, I feel like every family has their issues, whether that's big or small, but having to go through them on a public stage, I think makes it all the more difficult. But I think that's also why, why people are so intrigued by them, is that in some ways they can relate to them the way that, every family has issues. And as you say, all the wealth and power and privilege, you can't escape that, I think, is something that certainly it sells newspapers, but it also, I think, makes people, it keeps that connection going. The fact that they aren't infallible.
Yeah. I think for the last few generations who may have been brought up on Disney, the idea of being a prince or a princess is like the coolest thing ever. But I honestly can't think of anything worse.
I know. And I think about that, I think as an American, of course, we don't have that. And the idea of a family where, it's a family that is a family, but it's also an institution where certain people have certain roles. And there's, King Charles was always going to become king, and that was his role in the family. And I always just think about if that was your sibling and you had an entirely different relationship with your family as an institution, the firm, if you will, kind of thinking about how that would impact your relationships or how that would impact your relationship with your parent to know, okay, when I die, this is who's replacing me. I think that's it's so fascinating psychologically. And so, again, I say different from what we have in the US.
Yeah. And the way people are brought up in terms of how much affection they do or don't get from their parents has a massive impact on their lives as adults. And especially when they interact with other people, if they weren't brought up with cuddles and love, and then they go to a friend's house or a girlfriend's house and see them all being affectionate with each other and thinking, oh, I never had that. How strange. And understanding the differences. Reading Harry's book when he talked about his father coming in and sitting on his bed telling him that his mother had died and he didn't hug him. And it was all very kind of formal, as opposed to a loving father telling him such tragic news. And that really hit me, that moment, to think that it wasn't just about a father and a son having a hug, having a cuddle and a cry together. It was all almost businesslike, which is very strange.
I mean, I agree. I think I think everything to do with Princess Diana's death is so tragic. And I think it's so interesting to think about the outpouring of grief that came from the public, of course, the mourning in the streets. And you've seen the photos of all of the flowers outside Kensington Palace and the people literally weeping, in the streets. And in contrast, kind of what was happening within the royal family and how they were so unprepared to deal with it, both from a public perspective, but also internally, and how to comfort two young boys who have just lost their mother. It was just a tragedy all around.
Yeah. And were you able to see similar tragedies in the Kennedy family? I know you were looking at tragedies on both sides. Obviously, Absolutely. They've had their fair share of losses, haven't they?
They've had their fair share of losses, yes. And I think it was interesting speaking with some people who are close with JFK Jr., who is President Kennedy's son. So, I think there's this famous photo of JFK Jr. saluting at his father's funeral, saluting his father's casket. And that has become kind of an iconic image of that funeral. And in speaking with people who were close to him, he was only 3 years old. He had just turned 3 years old that day. He didn't remember that. He certainly didn't speak about it often, his father's funeral, but what he did speak about was how difficult it was when his mother died and when he had to, perform that grief publicly. And when he just wanted to be with the people who knew her best. And she died young as well. She died from cancer. She was not an old woman. And I think it was sudden. And he really struggled with that idea of performing tragedy in the public eye. But similarly, to draw a parallel between him and Princess Diana, he found Princess Diana's death very difficult. He was also pursued by the paparazzi. He knew Carolyn, his wife, had a difficult time with the media, and the manner in which Princess Diana died really bothered them. And so, he was running a magazine at the time. He was running George Magazine, and he found it very difficult to think of how they were going to cover Princess Diana's death. And they eventually did a really beautiful photo spread. And I spoke with the photographer of that piece, and he remembered speaking with John and saying, like, would this ever happen in America? I don't know. What the kind of outpouring of grief for Princess Diana's funeral. And, just a few years later, John F. Kennedy Jr. tragically passed away in a plane crash alongside his wife, Carolyn. And there was a similar outpouring of grief. There was kind of a impromptu memorial outside of his apartment in New York City. And again, just like a real outpouring of mourning from the public.
Because there's loads of conspiracy theories, aren't there, around the deaths of all the Kennedys, I think, because it does seem so weird and awful and tragic how many of them have died under tragic circumstances. So, of course, it's a field day for conspiracy theorists to try. Even Princess Diana, there's lots of theories around that as well. Have you looked at those in the book?
A little bit. I talk about kind of how in both of those circumstances, my opinion is that they're just tragic things that happened. I think for the Kennedys, I think they lived life in the public eye in such a way, and they wanted, but at the same time, JFK Jr. was seeking privacy. He was very confident in his flying skills, that he was perhaps misplaced confidence, but he was flying because he was flying himself and Carolyn and her sister Lauren because he didn't want to be in public on that flight. So again, kind of seeking privacy. I think that was the same for Princess Diana. But I think when tragic things happen, kind of people think in two ways. They either think, oh, the most logical thing is this is just a very sad thing that happened. But when you can't explain it, when there's not an explanation, I think some people go the furthest other side and they say, there must be an explanation. There must be something nefarious happening here. And yes, I think the internet has only kind of fed into that, certainly. And I talk about that a little bit in kind of these families' legacies today.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you summarize that, because people do want an explanation. But when we think about death in our own lives, when it's our family members, people close to us, very often there isn't a decent explanation for that either. You know, death seems really unfair and tragic most of the time, whoever it's happening to. But yet we don't see conspiracies in our own lives. We just see it as a tragic death.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's interesting to think in that way, but yeah, I think these two families, I also think part of it is Hollywood's interest in both of these families. And then sometimes they delve into the conspiracies, kind of these fictionalized retellings of both of these families' lives, where I think sometimes the truth gets a little bit blurry. You know, I think, certainly The Crown, I think, was huge for the royal family because it took people inside the palace and offered them kind of, one version of what conversations might have looked like. But then I think people, of course, that's not exactly what happened. And I think that's the same with, Hollywood retellings of the Kennedy story. None of it is 100% accurate unless it is a documentary. But I think sometimes that gets muddled in people's minds when they watch and they're like, was this real or was this just for a television show and things like that? I think that adds into it as well.
And it's very easy to forget, even when you're watching The Crown and you know that it's not a documentary. As you say, you're still watching it going, I can't believe she said that to her.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's a wonderful television program. And I think in some ways it gets kind of to the heart of accuracy. There's what was factually correct and then there's what, feels true to what might have happened. And I think those are two different things.
Yeah, because you're thinking, well, there must be some truth in this. They can't have just made that up. When it was the meeting between, I think, Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister at the time, there was quite a few scenes with her interacting with the Queen, and it was just the two of them in the room. So obviously you're thinking, well, both of them, I think the Queen had died when that came out. I'm not sure. But either way, you're like, well, clearly neither of them had been consulted about these conversations in order to make The Crown. So you're like, is there a biographer out there that knows what happened between the two of them, or is the whole thing just completely made up?
Right. It's a good question, and I think I think with the Kennedys, it's interesting because obviously the royal family is an institution that kind of they have a codified role. They have a specific job that is the job that they do. The Kennedys, they don't have that. And so when you think about what is it that continues to keep them in the public eye, it really is popular culture, which I think is interesting and why Hollywood continues to remake things. I don't know if Love Story was on where your audience listens, but I think that was a huge success in the US and also in the UK. And I think that it brought more people who might be unfamiliar with the Kennedy story kind of into that story. And then there's going to be a big program on Netflix. I believe they're filming now about JFK's young life. So this interest in the Kennedys in terms of media kind of only persists.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the interview with Oprah a few years ago that Harry and Meghan did, which, of course, shocked the world for different reasons. Also, we had the interview with Prince Andrew that didn't go down very well at all. A complete disaster, in fact. Obviously, Princess Diana did a famous interview that seemed to go down well with people if they liked her, but not if they didn't. Have there been similar big public interviews with the Kennedys?
Less so. I think so when just a few days after President Kennedy died, tragically, was assassinated, his wife Jackie gave one interview to Life magazine, and she kind of gave her perspective on the Kennedy administration. And that's when she kind of set forth this idea of a Kennedy Camelot, so she was tying her husband's administration to kind of the myth of King Arthur and Camelot and this court where the arts and goodness were valued and those sort of things. And so she put that forth, this idea. And that is kind of a nickname and a concept that continues to persist. You see that when people are referencing the Kennedys in newspaper headlines today, even. But Jackie didn't give interviews after that, which is interesting to think about. She kind of did her one moment with the press, and then she didn't really speak about her husband's administration any further. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't kind of do a tell-all. She didn't do anything like that. And I think it's interesting to think about the power that has to do kind of one interview, and similarly kind of with the various sit-downs, the impact that they have to do kind of one big interview and then not speak with the press very often. I think that it holds enormous power, that kind of restraint. But then thinking about John F. Kennedy Jr., he launched his own magazine in a way to give him a platform to speak to issues that he wanted to in the way that he wanted to. So he didn't want that intermediary of a different journalist to perhaps kind of shape his words. He wanted to be able to speak directly to the public. And I think in a way that's it previews kind of how the royals in particular use social media now. I think they see that as a way to speak directly to the people that they're interested, the people that are interested in the royal family, that are interested in what they're doing without kind of going through the press as an intermediary. It's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And people's relationship with the press in the public eye is always interesting. There's lots of celebrities, not necessarily for either family that we're talking about today, but who never do interviews, never do photo shoots. They're never in the public eye at all. They have their job, whether it's as an actress, a singer, a footballer, or whatever it might be. And you don't really know anything much about them at all because they're not on social media. They keep themselves completely out of the public eye. And you can really sort of appreciate that they're someone that has no interest in being in the public eye whatsoever. But then there are people that sort of dip in and out, and sometimes the public don't like that. People often said about Princess Diana, she knows how to use the press. She uses them when she wants them. And then when she doesn't, she decides, you need to leave me alone. I want my privacy. And I just think it must be so complicated and difficult to be in the public eye, because I think whoever you are, you have the right to say, please don't photograph me now. Please don't photograph my children. Please just leave us alone. And from what I could tell, she was always polite when saying that to the press, but people didn't like it.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm just thinking in my head, I don't know if you're interested in Taylor Swift at all, but all the hullabaloo about her wedding upcoming this week and what we might see or not see. I mean, I think the media's interest in that sort of thing is so, fervent for some people. And as you say, some people are able to step away completely. And it's more when people kind of dip in and out that people might have more of an issue with it. And also you don't have, of course, fame in that way does come with some benefits. You think of Princess Diana and the way that she was able to shine a spotlight on causes that might not see attention, whether that's homelessness or landmines or AIDS victims, when that was such a more taboo topic. And so, she really wielded the spotlight in that way and was able to use it sometimes to do real good. And so you think, of course, the scrutiny must have been unimaginable, but at the same time, she was able to use it, which I think is so interesting and, commendable. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's been really fascinating chatting with you. I think it's great that you've done this book and comparing the two families. The book is called The Kennedys and The Windsors, the story of two dynasties, one born, one made. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Caroline Helleman, who we've been chatting with today. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a good week.
You too.